Welcome back to Empire's podcast, The Ottomans. I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and thank you for stopping by. Are you tired of waiting around for Ottoman Empire episodes? Then please check out Cathargo Nova, Understanding Mythology podcast. I couldn't restrain myself from leaving this show a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, and I hope you will too. Here is a little teaser.
Hey everyone, this is Carthago Nova, and I host a series of podcasts called Understanding Mythology. In this podcast, we celebrate mankind's oldest and most treasured stories, but also dig deep into comparative mythology. We talk biology, anthropology, history, and more to decipher their laden metaphors. By understanding mythology, we can learn more about ourselves and the world around us. Hope to see you there.
Link to the show is in the show notes, so head on over and check it out. You can also shoot me an email for comments, suggestions, and respectful corrections and criticisms. Empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's empiresofhistorypodcast, one word, @gmail.com. Did you know that I'm also on Twitter? Why not stop by and say hi and maybe follow? @EmpiresPodcast, one word. Again, that's @EmpiresPodcast. Do you have an interest in listening to short stories? I also have a horror fiction podcast. Please see the show notes if you're interested and check it out. And as it turns out, a great deal of my listener support is from the wonderful state of Texas. I'd like to give you all a special shout out, so stay tuned towards the end. And now, without any further ado, Sultan Mehmed I, Janissary Reform, Restoring Anatolia, and Brooding Rumelia, Episode 15. In Episode 14, we left Mehmed in a somewhat poor predicament. The Karmanids were up in arms again, trying to be the big kid on the block. Multiple Anatolian Beys had broken off from Ottoman control. Local lords asserted their independence aggressively. On the European side of the Ottoman Empire, its possessions, lands, vassals, and territory was known collectively as Rumelia, and Wallachia was proving to be a determined foe. And like in Anatolia, vassals tested the resolve of central authorities. Albania, and I know I didn't talk much about Albania in our last episode, would rise up in full rebellion against the Ottomans, and northern Serbia shook off central control. Even though things looked bleak in 1413, for Mehmed, there was still sun peeking through the clouds. As Sultan Mehmed surveyed his empire, he counted upon 3 advantages that would aid him in restoring the empire to its previous territorial status and stability. The first and greatest weapon in his arsenal was the unflinching loyalty of the Janissary Corps. Way back in Episode 5, titled Sultan Murad I, Janissaries and Chernomen, I talked very briefly how Murad established an elite force composed of Christian captives and children collected from the Balkans. And just so you know, I plan on doing a series of special episodes dedicated to the Janissaries themselves as standalone, so I don't want to spend too much time on them here. And at this point, if you are listening, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The series on the Janissaries I'm planning, I have found some wonderful primary research, and it will exist behind a Patreon's only account, or some other paywall. It will also come with a YouTube companion video where I plan maps, outlines of Ottoman camps, fortresses, and yes, famous battles. You won't want to miss this. So if you're interested in hearing a really cool continuous narrative on the Janissaries, please email me at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And I promise the first 20 people to email me with Janissary in the subject line, I'll make sure you get the Janissaries for free. The main podcast on the Ottomans will, however, remain free. And now back to our show. As I researched this episode, I discovered that there is a bit of a controversy surrounding, not surprisingly, exactly when and who established the Janissaries. Most will say, as I did in episode 5, that Sultan Mehmed I founded the corps. However, I came across a first-hand account by a Janissary who served during the reign of none other than Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror. His name was, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Konstantini Milokovic, and his work was translated from Ottoman Turkish to English during the 19th century. It's titled Memoirs of a Janissary. To sum up, Constantine says that it was not in fact Mehmed I who founded his beloved corps, but instead it was Mehmed I. It appears that in 1413, the Janissaries may not have been the centralized and professional force of Lore, but was instead composed mainly of mercenaries, Christian knights who had defected to the Ottomans, while only a small portion hailed from the Ottoman Devshirme system. Mehmed's first move was to reform the Janissaries at once. He paid off the mercenaries and scattered the rest to remote outposts along the frontier. The betrayal of Musa in 1413 by the Aga of his own Janissary contingent must have weighed in Mehmed's decision. Free to rebuild the corps with a whole new ethos, Mehmed's agents spread out in the Balkan provinces of the empire, recruiting young men aged 16 to 19 for immediate enrollment in the Janissaries. Working simultaneously, the Devshirme system collected Christian children aged 10 through 13, and the boys were sent to farms in Anatolia to labor, learn the customs and language of the Ottomans, and convert to Islam. Then, at about 16 or 19, they'd be funneled into the Janissaries, with the brighter kids sent to the palace or provincial administration. As part of the reform, a permanent full-time regiment called an orta, with its own colonel or aga, was founded and devoted itself completely to training, recruitment, pay, logistics, and campaign planning. This headquarter orta would travel with the Sultan, campaign with the Sultan, but more importantly, form a nucleus of an Ottoman general staff officer system that would serve the empire in the following decades. It is no wonder, then, that the Janissary Constantine credits Mehmed as the true founder of the corps. Gauging an exact figure for how many Janissaries there were during this period is somewhat of a moving target, but most of the sources I've read put the corps between 6,000 and 10,000. While this may not seem like a lot to us, we must consider the fact that most of the isolated beylics in Anatolia could only muster around 3,000 to 5,000 men at a time. If anything, the Sultan now traveled around with a hardcore group of soldiers who were better paid, better trained, and more loyal than his enemies. The Christian powers in Europe were another matter altogether, this is true, but still, the Sultan had a mobile force that any would-be Western power had to take seriously. At this point in Ottoman history, we see a shift in both the perception of the office of Sultan and the head of the Ottoman imperial family himself begin to emerge. Whereas Orhan, Murad, and Bayezid were documented eating with their own troops off earthen plates and walking around the camps and towns unescorted, Mehmed made a conscious effort to set the person and office of the Sultan at a higher status than it was in the past. Gone were the days when a Venetian ambassador had to ask who the Sultan was while paying his respects at the funeral of an important Ottoman princess, as the sultans used to be at great pains to portray themselves as simply the first among equals. Under Mehmed's reign, he wanted it known by virtue of holding the office of Sultan, and as a Prince of Osman, he had that special something extra that set him ahead of all other men. Thus, with his reformed Janissaries came the first dedicated 24/7 bodyguards to separate the Sultan away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. As the Ottoman court transformed itself into a mobile governing and military leadership hub, it added food testers against poison, physicians looking after the Sultan's health, and several hundred pages and servants. Every member of the Sultan's retinue possessed a dual purpose he was keenly aware of. First was in making sure the person of the Sultan was the most physically protected human body on the planet, and second, ensuring the Sultan's day ran super efficient so Mehmed could milk productivity from every second of every minute of every hour in the day. Because, as we shall see, the master of the empire lived under severe pressures and threats, the combined weight of which could end not only his life, but shatter the empire. The second advantage enjoyed by Mehmed was the support of two Anatolian Beylics. Now, it may seem to the listener, after everything we've been over, that every single bey and emir in Asia Minor was just waiting for the Ottomans to turn their back, so they could place a well-timed dagger between the shoulder blades. However, all was not the case. Back in episode 13, we covered the conflict between Musa and Mehmed, and in 1413 saw Mehmed triumphant. What I didn't cover was the support Mehmed received from the Anatolian Bey of Dulkadir, a man named Șaban Suli Bey. Mehmed had married the bey's daughter a few months before his battle with Musa. Her name was Emin Khatun, a princess who hailed from one of the Islamic world's most respected families of the day. It appears as though the good Dulkadir Bey was hedging his bets during the civil wars, as the contender for the throne vied for his daughter's hand in marriage. In early 1413, Șaban Bey made his move and offered his daughter to Mehmed, along which came the aid of his horsemen and money. After the battle, the Sultan could now count on the Bey of Dulkadir to act as a balancing power against the other beys who rose up against the Ottomans. The Beylic of Dulkadir wasn't the only support Mehmed enjoyed. Located in eastern Anatolia, Karaside was one of the very first Beylics to be conquered by the Ottomans way back in the mid-1300s. The leading families of Karaside apparently took a liking to their Ottoman conquerors, and many pashas, agas, and frontier leaders came into the service of the empire from these notable families. And the Karasides, like Dulkadir, acted as a buffer for the Ottoman state against the more hostile beys in Anatolia. Sultan Mehmed thus enjoyed the support of a reformed Janissary Corps and a steady stream of income, men, and supplies, and probably just as important, political clout from the previously mentioned two beys. However, I would like to mention, none of these material advantages would come to mean anything if they were not coupled with Mehmed's third and his really big advantage, his incredible natural abilities and talents. In his youth, he excelled in hunting, poetry, philosophy, history, and mathematics. Whereas most European nobility were surprisingly illiterate, Mehmed enjoyed the benefits of both a classical Islamic education and the instruction given him by the Ottoman state apparatus when he was a teenager. The end result was an intelligent and capable man, able to read the diplomatic winds, who carefully consulted a vast network of military, political, and religious intelligence before deciding on a course of action. Yet, at the same time, he had that rare quality to not only consult all available sources, but he could make a snap, on-the-spot decision when he found himself in the clutch. For the next century, the Ottomans struck gold when it came to the sultans. Men of caliber, intelligence, ambition, and vision just like Mehmed would come to the throne and guide the ship of state through dangerous waters to hegemonic powerhouse status. Surveying the landscape after reforming the Janissaries and the headquarter elements of his government, Mehmed's first priority was bringing the Anatolian Beys back under Ottoman control, or, failing that, at least neutralizing them politically, especially the Karmanids. Hello there. I'm sorry for yet another interruption, and I know that this is a change in pace for Empire's podcast, but I couldn't help but think about my unintentional hiatus of over a year. I love doing this show, and if the emails I received are any indication, my listeners do as well. With that being said, all I'm asking is that you hit the pause button right now, head on over to Apple Podcasts, and pound out a 5-star review. These reviews really help in bringing in more listeners, because, truth be told, this podcast, through my own fault, has lost listenership since I quit doing this back in June of 2019. I know I have a long road ahead, but much like Mehmed does in restoring the empire, I'm grinding along as best I can. The time it takes to research these episodes, record, edit, promote, and release them does take a significant amount of my personal time. I'm not asking for money at this point, but reviews just really help my morale in keeping the show going. So if you find the time, consider leaving me a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. Right now, the listenership for our show is hovering at over 400. If just a quarter of my listeners left a 5-star review, I would have something to show my wife, that this little side project of mine is at least touching the lives of other people for the good. And so thank you, and now let's get back to the show. Therefore, with an aim of showing the Anatolian Beys he wasn't some spoiled kid to be messed with, Mehmed left Aydin in 1414. I suppose that campaign could be too strong of a term here. Always careful of the optics of a Muslim ruler rolling in and crushing fellow believers, Mehmed couched his expedition in friendship and helping terminology in his official correspondence with some of the more worried Beys. You know, he was just going to head on down and see if he could help the rebellious Beys with anything. Nothing bad here. One by one, the Anatolian Beys rethought their previous belligerent stance as Mehmed crossed the Dardanelles with his corps of Janissaries, where he was later joined with Akinci and Sipahi horsemen. In the middle of 1414, the Beys began sending envoys to Mehmed, who had taken up residence in Bursa. They began to offer their allegiance once again to the Ottoman throne. However, all didn't go according to the Sultan's wishes. Along the southwestern coast of Anatolia, the Emir of Aydin, a fellow by the name of Cuneyd, fortified the town of Izmir as soon as he got wind that Mehmed was afoot. Izmir was an important seaport and focal point of trade from the east to the wider Mediterranean world and beyond. In the center of the town was a series of fortified keeps and strongholds, and Cuneyd took up residence in one of them. And then he announced to everybody that Aydin was fully independent of the Ottoman Empire. This, of course, was intolerable. The loss of Izmir could mean the arrival of Christian Crusader armies straight into the heart of Anatolia, much like had happened in the First Crusade in 1096, or the diversion of trade routes away from Bursa, which could mean economic disaster. By 1415, Mehmed had had enough. He rolled over the irregular militia forces sent to stop his progress and arrived at the fortresses in the heart of Izmir. Cuneyd did not give in when he saw the overwhelming Ottoman response. His provisions were well supplied, and he knew that a prolonged siege would cost the Sultan time, a commodity he didn't have. Mehmed, though, like I said earlier, was a man of many talents, and diplomacy was at the top of this list. After a few letters and some exchanges of prisoners and treasure, help came from all the people you'd least expect, the Knights of Rhodes. The Knights agreed to send their top engineers and sappers to help the Ottomans. After a little over a week, the fortresses fell, one by one, to the combined assault of the Knights and Ottoman forces. Pretty soon, Mehmed had defeated and then captured alive Cuneyd. He did a very curious thing then. He not only spared Cuneyd's life, but actually appointed him to a very, and I mean extremely important post overseeing the frontier between the Ottoman Empire and Wallachia. I'm not 100% sure why Mehmed decided on this course of action. Maybe he wanted to paint himself as a benign ruler, but when I look at the situation involving the Cuneyd, the man had never surrendered, but had been captured after a cost in men, money, and material. Anywho, Cuneyd was sent to the Wallachian frontier to take his post of governor of Nikopol, Oh, to have been a fly on the Sultan's tent while that discussion was taking place. By 1416, Mehmed poked his head out of his tent and dared to breathe easy for a second or two. His western flank seemed secure enough that maybe he could get away with marching up to the Karmenids and paying the old rival a visit. But disturbing reports made their way into his camp to upset this apple cart. Emperor Manuel II, sitting in Constantinople, had been watching Mehmed with anxiety. This Sultan wasn't some flavor-of-the-week nobody. From the reports streaming into the capital, it looked like this new guy was more in the vein of his forefathers, Orhan and Murad I. Things weren't looking up for the Byzantines. The emperor realized that if he didn't act soon, then the Ottoman state would become once again the worst existential threat the Byzantines had ever faced. Manuel decided now was the time to play his trump card. Well, his only card if you get right down to it at this point. Another Ottoman prince would make a play for the throne. His name was Mustafa, allegedly the son of the late defeated Prince Musa. I say allegedly because sources aren't sure if he wasn't just another pretender. The marriage records of Musa are spotty at best, and the only clout Mustafa had was that the emperor said he was the son of Musa and loaded him up with gold and treasure. Even the Venetians referred to him as, quote, the false prince Mustafa, end quote. So yeah, if I was Mehmed, I'd be pretty pissed off at this point. The Byzantines still had some lands left in Anatolia. At an outpost in the far distant land of Trebizond, a stronghold nestled deep in the mountain ranges, the emperor released Mustafa. The pretender sailed along the Black Sea coast all the way up to the mouth of the Danube River and straight into the ruler of Greater Wallachia's lands, Mircea. By the time Mehmed learned of A. Mustafa's existence, B. his release, and C. him moving into Wallachia, and making buddy-buddy with Mircea, the Sultan also had dropped in his lap an official correspondence from the Shah of the Timur Empire. It appeared as though the Shah was bothered by the deaths of Mehmed's brothers in his war to gain the throne, and the Shah warned the Sultan not to, under any circumstances, make moves against the Karmenids. At this point, the Orhan and Murad I parts of Mehmed's psychology asserted themselves, and he took stock of the geostrategic situation unfolding before him. It seemed like the West and now Islamic Eastern powers had no desire to see the return of a strong Ottoman state. They would use pretenders to the throne for decades to come, in an effort to distract and weaken the Sultan as best they could. Realizing that he risked being cut off in Anatolia, another rather depressing report came in. Hey, Sultan Mehmed, remember that emir you defeated at Izmir? Yes, Cuneyd, whom your Imperial Highness was gracious enough to have spared his life? Well, it appears as though Cuneyd, Mircea, and now Mustafa have all been talking, and the three men have decided that, well, they don't like you very much. Mehmed didn't dally very long. He made peace with Timur, and although he offered no promises to not come back and give the Karmenids a good spanking, he knew that he'd have to hightail it back to Rumelia and get to the border with Wallachia as soon as possible. Next time, we are going to watch as Mehmed shoots up and across the Dardanelles and straight to Edirne to take stock of the situation. The year 1416 would become something of a watershed in the reign of Mehmed, and I'm looking forward to covering that and more in the next episode. I know that in last episode I promised we'd get to the rebellion, or revolution depending on how you look at it, of Sheikh Bedreddin. However, detailing the context and geostrategic outlook of Mehmed's reign proved too much to cram into one episode. So here we are, running up short on time. But the delay has allowed me to get some extra research in, and I'm confident you'll enjoy what I have coming up. I read somewhere that a good way to connect with your listeners, especially the hardcore ones who stick around long enough and listen to me ramble on and on at the end of an episode, is to reach out and read the analytics from the places they are listening from. Last episode, I read to you all the top countries Imperiesophistorypodcast the Ottomans are hailing from. Today, I'd like to say that the great state of Texas accounts for a very large proportion of listeners, 35% to be exact. And everybody listening, I'm eternally grateful. With that being said, I'd like to read out the places my host platform is telling me you are all listening from. Midland, Austin, San Antonio, Richmond, Dallas, Gainesville, Prosper, Spring, Houston, Texarkana, I had to Google that one and I may be mispronouncing it, Arlington, Allen, and Belton. Thanks so much, my Texas listeners. I have family in Texas, and my late mother was from there, so the Lone Star State will always have a special place in my heart. Thank you, and I look forward to next time.